They call me a failure. At 16, my father looked me in the eye and deemed me unworthy of the Sterling name, kicking me onto the street with nothing but a duffel bag and a shattered ego. 25 years later, I sit atop a multi-billion-dollar empire, the anonymous Mr. Elias Vance, a titan of corporate restructuring. Now, the Sterlings, the paragons of Connecticut wealth and tradition, are facing absolute ruin, drowning in debt, and begging for a miracle. The sickest twist? I am the only miracle worker they can afford, and they have no idea they are about to face the ghost of their abandoned son. Before we dive into this incredible tale of revenge and vindication, let me know where you're watching from. Hit that like button, subscribe for more epic true stories, and brace yourself. You won't believe the gilded prison I grew up in. My life began in a gilded cage in Greenwich, Connecticut, a place where the air itself smelled of old money and impossible standards. The Sterling family estate was a sprawling, three-story colonial revival, a masterpiece of architecture with perfectly symmetrical windows and a massive portico supported by white fluted columns. The grounds were meticulously manicured, an endless green carpet that faded into dense, old-growth forest. It was, from the outside, the definition of generational success. But inside, it was a mausoleum, cold, silent, and entirely sterile. Every Persian rug, every oil portrait of a dead Sterling, every antique piece of mahogany furniture felt less like decor and more like a heavy shackle. We didn't live there, we performed there. The source of this opulence, and the root of my misery, was Sterling and Sons Manufacturing. For over a century, the company had produced high-end industrial components, precision gears, specialized alloys, and niche machinery for the defense and aerospace sectors. It symbolized tradition, prestige, and, most crushingly for me, unyielding expectation. To be a Sterling meant being groomed for this factory, this legacy, this machine. My father, Arthur Sterling, was the living embodiment of the Sterling doctrine. He was a tall man with a shock of silver hair and eyes that rarely conveyed warmth, only judgment. He was obsessed with legacy, lineage, and a painfully narrow definition of success. Ivy League degrees, careers in finance or corporate law, or, ideally, running the factory. Arthur's love was a currency, and it was conditional on achievement. My bank account was always empty. My mother, Eleanor Sterling, was the silent enforcer. She was perpetually focused on social standing, the next charity gala, and maintaining the family's flawless image. Her cruelty wasn't overt. It was passive-aggressive, a constant, sharp commentary on my lack of fit. She prioritized Arthur's approval and the family's societal perception over my emotional well-being, enabling his coldness by simply pretending not to notice it. Then there were the siblings. Richard, my older brother, was the golden boy. He was 5 years my senior, easily conformed to every expectation, possessed natural charisma, and was perfectly groomed to take over the business. He never had to try. He simply was what they wanted. My sister, Sarah, was passively critical of me. She rarely spoke up, but her frequent, pitying looks and quiet reinforcement of my outsider status stung more than my father's rage. In the Sterling ecosystem, I was the clear, ugly mutation. My failure wasn't a lack of intelligence, it was a nonconformity of application. I struggled with the subjects Arthur valued. Calculus bored me, and business history felt like reading glorified propaganda. Yet, I possessed an unparalleled, almost obsessive, talent for complex systems analysis and predictive modeling. I saw the world not as a series of random events, but as predictable, logical flows of data. I could look at a flow chart, a spreadsheet, or even a traffic intersection and instantly model its inefficiencies. My family dismissed this as playing with computers. They viewed my fascination with code and logic as a childish distraction from the real work of social climbing and asset management. I remember one highly detailed incident, a core memory that defines the chasm between us. I was 15, and I had spent 6 months secretly developing an early predictive model for Sterling and Sons' inventory management system using an old, slow PC I had salvaged and hidden in the attic. My model showed that by restructuring the raw materials supply chain, moving from 2 local vendors to 3 international, volume-based vendors, the factory could save 18% on acquisition costs. I was beaming, convinced this tangible contribution would finally earn Arthur's respect. I presented the printouts, proudly showing the data simulation and the logic flow. Arthur didn't even look at the numbers. He looked at the low-grade paper, then at the cheap plastic keyboard I'd retrieved, sitting awkwardly on his antique desk. He sneered, calling it a child's parlor trick and a waste of time that should have been spent studying corporate law. Then, in a slow, deliberate motion that was far more terrifying than a shout, he picked up a heavy bronze paperweight and smashed the keyboard. "You will not distract yourself with this nonsense, Nathan," he stated, his voice dangerously low. "You will study discipline and backbone. This is what real intelligence looks like." He ordered me to study 3 chapters of a book on 19th-century manufacturing trusts. The destruction of that keyboard wasn't just physical. It was the final destruction of my hope that he would ever value my kind of mind. The emotional contrast between the cold, logical perfection of my models and the messy, cruel unpredictability of my family's emotional system was profound. I retreated further into the world of logic, where things made sense, and success wasn't determined by pedigree, but by the elegance of your solution. That retreat ultimately saved me. My junior year in high school was a pressure cooker designed by the Sterlings to forge compliant heirs, or, in my case, to melt down the rebellious scrap metal. I lived under the constant shadow of Richard's excellence. Every achievement of mine was benchmarked against his stellar academic record. My B+ in English was a failure because Richard had earned an A in Advanced Placement English Literature. The worst part was the required family study sessions. These weren't quiet times of collaboration. They were public forums for my shaming. Arthur would sit at the head of the massive dining table, watching Richard easily parse complex economic texts while I stumbled over Roman history or failed to grasp the nuances of complex M&A law. He wouldn't shout. He would sigh, a sound loaded with crushing disappointment, and say to Eleanor, "The bloodline is strong, but the dilution is evident." Driven by this humiliation, the extended conflict began. I couldn't conform, but I wouldn't stop trying to prove my intelligence outside their narrow definition. I started frequenting the public library computer lab, miles away, or crashing at the house of a few sympathetic acquaintances whose parents were never home. There, I devoured advanced programming languages like Python and C++, running financial simulations and economic models. I was learning to model markets, predict downturns, and visualize complex supply chains. This wasn't just study. It was an act of intellectual defiance, a desperate need to build an unassailable fortress of self-worth based on objective truth. I developed an acute understanding of how businesses succeed and, more importantly, how they fail. The Sterlings operated on intuition and tradition. I was learning to master logic and foresight. This secret curriculum became my lifeline. The tension culminated during the college application process, the sacred Sterling ritual that confirmed one's worth. Richard had already secured an early acceptance to Harvard Law. I had secretly applied to 2 highly specialized engineering/data science programs, MIT and Caltech, programs Arthur barely recognized, thinking they were beneath the Sterling reputation. I knew I wouldn't get in based on my high school GPA, which I'd neglected in favor of my secret studies, but I had sent in my personal models as part of my application portfolio. The catalyst event happened in December. The letters arrived. Richard's was, predictably, a celebration. Mine was a cold, polite rejection from both. Arthur's reaction was not immediate anger, but a public, drawn-out dressing down at a formal family dinner, hosted for some corporate friends. He didn't even address the guests. He pointed a fork at me, his face pale with fury, and said loud enough for everyone to hear, This rejection, is the fruit of indiscipline. Nathan has demonstrated a fundamental lack of respect for the opportunities he was born into. He is a stain on the Sterling name. He has proven he lacks the discipline and backbone required for real success. He made sure everyone knew I was not just a disappointment, but an active liability. In that moment, I reached my final realization. I didn't want their life. I only wanted my father's respect, and I now knew that respect was biologically impossible to earn. They didn't reject my effort. They rejected my nature. The path to freedom was not through compliance, but through departure. I planned to leave immediately after graduation, but Arthur, eager to excise the wound, sped up the timeline. I felt a profound emotional isolation. I often thought of myself as an alien, a system built on Boolean logic trapped in a family operating on antiquated social protocols. I felt more secure and less judged by the abstract logic of code than the unpredictable, conditioned cruelty of human emotion. The event that triggered the kick-out was ironically the one moment I tried to help them most directly. I had continued to refine the analysis of Sterling and Sons, using the skills I had honed. I had compiled a physical, handwritten ledger, a detailed, self-taught financial analysis of the company's outdated logistics model, accounting for the technological shifts in the industry that Arthur refused to acknowledge. The ledger predicted a devastating $12 million operational loss within 5 years due to systemic system lag, inefficient supply chains, and ballooning fixed costs. The final argument Arthur discovered the ledger hidden beneath my mattress. He didn't see data, he saw insubordination. He interpreted my meticulous work not as a helpful analysis, but as an arrogant, juvenile challenge to his 70 years of experience and the Sterling legacy itself. The confrontation happened in Arthur's mahogany-paneled office. The air was thick with the scent of old money, leather, and Arthur's ever-present pipe tobacco. He was incandescent, not with heat, but with a cold, controlled fury. He told me I was a liability, a cancerous drain on the resources that should be supporting Richard and Sarah, the worthy ones. The brutal ultimatum followed. I was being given one last choice. Renounce my computer nonsense entirely, enroll in a military school he had selected, and conform, or leave tonight. My unexpected response was a calm, almost surgical acceptance. The pain was gone, replaced by a crystalline clarity. The prison door was open, and I chose freedom. I looked at him, not with defiance, but with pity for his blindness, and said, "I'm leaving." The actual departure was swift. I packed a small duffel bag with 3 shirts, a pair of jeans, a cheap waterproof jacket, and, most importantly, my analysis notes. I considered those notes my true wealth, the only proof of my intellect that hadn't been shattered by a paperweight. Eleanor appeared briefly, offering no defense, only a look of profound, mortified embarrassment. She was concerned about what the maid might think. Richard and Sarah watched from the top of the sweeping grand staircase, silent, like spectators at a necessary public execution. Arthur's last words were a curse and a final, indelible rejection. "Don't come back, Nathan. You are no longer a Sterling. You are a failure, and failures don't get second chances here." I didn't reply. I simply walked out the heavy oak front door and into a late autumn rainstorm, feeling 2 contradictory emotions at once: devastating, gut-wrenching loss, and an exhilarating, terrifying freedom. I was 16 years old, utterly alone, and finally, truly, my own man. The immediate survival phase was a blur of cold nights and strategic resourcefulness. The small amount of cash I had saved disappeared quickly. I slept rough for a few weeks, finding shelter in the backs of abandoned buildings near a train yard, before finding a precarious rotation of couches belonging to former classmates and their parents, none of whom could risk my presence long-term. The initial days were defined by humiliation. I attempted panhandling briefly near a commuter station, but the experience, the averted eyes, the crushing sense of invisibility was too much. The act of asking for charity felt like confirming Arthur's verdict of failure. I stopped almost immediately, replacing the impulse to beg with an overwhelming, almost pathological drive for self-sufficiency. My plan solidified: education and income. I enrolled in night school for GED classes, but my real classroom was the public library. I used the libraries for warmth, shelter, and, critically, internet access. I devoured every free online course, every available economic paper, and every piece of financial news I could find. The hustle began in earnest. I realized my technical skills, the ones Arthur had mocked, were immediately marketable. Small businesses in the less affluent parts of town couldn't afford IT consultants, but they desperately needed help. I started fixing ancient desktop computers, removing viruses, and, most importantly, writing basic inventory and scheduling scripts for them in exchange for cash, small favors, or often food. This was where I learned the fundamentals of business, not through abstract theory, but through the harsh necessity of helping owners keep their doors open. My key incident in this period centered around a rundown, cash-only diner on the edge of the city, owned by a sharp-witted, kind woman named Maria. The diner was constantly running out of key ingredients, leading to massive waste. I spent 2 weeks observing her operations, then wrote a simple, elegant script that analyzed sales data, predicted ingredient needs based on the day of the week and weather, and automatically generated an optimized supplier order list. This wasn't just fixing a computer. I was streamlining a microeconomy. Maria didn't understand the code, but she understood the results. She immediately saved 15% on supplier costs and saw a massive reduction in spoiled produce. She was skeptical at first, but when the savings became undeniable, she became my anchor. She paid me in cash, but more importantly, she fed me hot meals and let me use the booth furthest from the window as my unofficial, temporary office. She provided not just money, but a sense of useful belonging, a stark contrast to the useless isolation of the Sterling Mansion. While I was attending night school to complete my GED, my true education was happening in the silence of the late-night library terminals. I wasn't just studying for tests. I was obsessively consuming everything related to corporate finance, global economic theory, and advanced software architecture. My innate system analysis skills blossomed from a frustrating hobby into a foundational, intellectual obsession. I realized that Arthur and Richard had failed to understand that business success wasn't about status. It was about the efficiency of systems. The Sterlings were failing because their system was antiquated. I was mastering the why of business failure, not emotional or personal failure, but the cold, logical collapse of an inefficient structure. This period instilled in me an almost pathological need for self-reliance. Every step I took, every line of code I wrote, every meal I earned, was a deliberate choice to ensure I would never again be beholden to anyone. I learned to anticipate needs, to never expose weakness, and to value discretion. The lesson from Arthur was burned into my core. Vulnerability is fatal. Independence is the only safety. I was building the shell of the man who would eventually become Elias Vance, piece by calculated piece. The failure label had not been forgotten. It was merely being refitted into armor. My trajectory changed abruptly and fundamentally when I was 19. I had leveraged my small business experience and managed to secure a low-level job as a junior tech assistant at a downtown Boston startup incubator. It was grunt work, setting up networks, troubleshooting software, but it gave me access to high-level meetings and, critically, high-stakes conversations. The meeting where I met Silas Chun was unremarkable to everyone else, but seismic to me. Silas was an older man, quiet and unassuming, yet he possessed a legendary, almost mythical status in the world of finance. He was known as the Cleaner, a quiet, ruthless dealmaker who specialized in distressed asset acquisition and restructuring. He was attending the meeting as a potential acquirer of one of the failing tech firms. During the meeting, the seasoned veterans were debating a multi-layered debt-for-equity swap. Everyone was talking in sweeping, general terms, focused on optics. I was busy running numbers in my head, when a key figure in the discussion made a simplifying assumption about the company's convertible note structure. I couldn't help myself. I muttered, almost under my breath, that assumption invalidates the dilution forecast. The trigger clause is tied to the Series B valuation, not the overall market cap. Silas, who had been silent, turned his head slowly. He hadn't noticed my lack of suit or my age. He had only noticed the precise accuracy of the technical correction. After the meeting, while everyone else was schmoozing, Silas approached me directly. He didn't ask for my resume or my credentials. He asked for the logic behind my observation. Silas offered me a chance to work for him immediately. It wasn't a formal job. It was an apprenticeship in the truest sense. He put me to work on the back end, crunching mountains of data, running acquisition simulations, and developing predictive financial models that were years ahead of their time. This wasn't theoretical knowledge. This was a high-stakes, real-world MBA earned under fire. Silas taught me everything Arthur refused to. Discretion. The greatest weapon in finance is the information others don't have. The power of reputation. Build a reputation for surgical precision and uncompromising ethics, and the world will pay you anything to solve its problems. Strategic enigma. True power lies not in the spotlight, like the Sterlings, who love the press, but in the shadows, controlling the strings. Silas taught me to become a ghost, visible only when I chose to be. He became the father figure I never had, one who valued logic, recognized my unique talent, and saw my deviation not as a failure, but as a specialized strength. He also saw the deep scar left by my family and understood the fuel it provided. Silas's greatest contribution was enabling my transformation. He helped me enroll in a non-traditional, highly accelerated degree program, mostly online and night classes, at a respected university. I focused purely on finance and data science, tearing through a 4-year curriculum in 2 intense years. This was where the name Elias Vance was conceptually born. The name Elias Vance was more than just an alias. It was a professional shield. Elias was calculated, emotionless, and professionally invulnerable. He had no history, no vulnerable past, and certainly no family baggage. He was the perfect execution of Silas's lessons in discretion and enigma. Nathan was the hungry, hurt boy. Elias Vance was the cold, calculating machine. Working alongside Silas for the next several years, Nathan, now operating as the increasingly formidable Elias Vance, was instrumental in securing several high-profile, discreet corporate takeovers. We didn't do hostile bids. We did calculated, surgical acquisitions based on deep, systemic analysis that identified the exact point of collapse. I earned a reputation for being unervingly precise and entirely emotionally detached from the human cost of business, a necessary defense mechanism. By age 28, largely through structured profit sharing and calculated personal investments based on my own models, I had made my first million. It was achieved not through luck or networking, but through relentless analytical foresight and calculated risk. At 35, I took Silas's blessing and a significant portion of my capital to found the Phoenix Advisory Group, PAG. The name was a tribute to my own life, rising from the ashes of the Sterling failure. The firm's mission was simple and uncompromising. Take on the cases no one else could or would touch. The deeply distressed, the legally tangled, the ones where the stakes were existential. We charged obscene fees, but we guaranteed results based on brutal, unvarnished truth. PAG operated with total anonymity. Clients communicated through a designated chief of staff, and I, Elias Vance, never gave interviews, never appeared in the press, and only met clients when absolutely necessary. My identity was protected by an impenetrable professional curtain. I had built the life Arthur wanted: power, wealth, influence. But I had built it by actively rejecting the person Arthur wanted me to be. Today, I am 41. I live in a minimalist, high-security penthouse apartment in Manhattan, designed for utility and efficiency, almost devoid of personal touches. I maintain an unyielding, structured daily routine, a self-imposed discipline that ensures I am never idle, never vulnerable. I have money that dwarfs the Sterling family's entire net worth, power that shifts global markets, and professional respect that is absolute. Yet, despite the reversal of the failure label, the scar remains. I am deeply guarded, and the emotional wall around my personal history is the greatest, most expensive defense mechanism I ever constructed. I have achieved everything, but the ghost of that 16-year-old boy, desperate for a father's approval, still whispers warnings. Never rely on anyone. They will always let you fall. That is the man the Sterlings are about to call for help. The Monday the request arrived began like any other, defined by the low hum of high-stakes precision. I was seated in my sterile, minimalist office, finalizing the complex, multi-jurisdictional merger of 2 European tech giants. The world viewed me as Elias Vance, the analytical genius who could see into the future of corporate collapse. The work was demanding, requiring surgical focus, and it served as a perfect, all-consuming distraction from the emotional complexities of human existence. My internal monologue often touched on the irony of my situation. I had achieved everything my father demanded: wealth, power, authority, but I had done so by rejecting his methods and his definitions. I felt nothing for the Sterlings. The emotion had been cauterized away years ago, replaced by a cold, scientific curiosity. My firewall, my only human point of contact, was Marcus, my longtime chief of staff. Marcus is a sharp, utterly loyal man who handles the entirety of PAG's external communications. He is the voice, the filter, and the impeccable professional representation of Elias Vance. He is also the only person on earth who knows the complete, horrifying truth about my past, as Nathan Sterling. Marcus screens a massive influx of desperate inquiries daily. We turn down 99% of them. PAG doesn't take on problems. We take on challenges that interest me strategically. Marcus, who rarely interrupts me during a high-level closing, appeared in my office, his face betraying a flicker of unease beneath his professional mask. He didn't speak, merely placing a thick, stapled document packet in front of me. The cover page contained the familiar, heavy-serif logo of a family firm, Sterling and Sons Manufacturing. I felt a moment of cold, profound shock, quickly masked by the Elias Vance shield. The world stopped for maybe half a second. I didn't flinch, didn't breathe differently, but my mind snapped to attention. I told Marcus to forward the full distress package without a single comment or question. He simply nodded and left. I spent the entire night focused on the documents. The emotional energy I brought to the analysis was zero. The intellectual energy was 100%. The irony was excruciating and total. Sterling and Sons was not just struggling. It was facing a catastrophic operational and legal obliteration. The $12 million operational loss I predicted at 16 was a massive understatement. The current figures suggested a potential 9-figure deficit. The core issues detailed in the packet read like a checklist of all the traditional arrogance I had fled. Massive, hidden debts stemming from a failed, outdated factory expansion into a niche market they didn't understand. Richard's idea executed with Arthur's ego. Outdated, neglected industrial technology, and worst of all, a pending environmental lawsuit that carried criminal charges and threatened instant, unrecoverable bankruptcy. The Sterlings had failed on every quantifiable metric. The accompanying letter was signed by Richard Sterling, who was now the overwhelmed, desperate CEO. The tone was a contradictory blend of panic and inherited entitlement. They were clearly out of options. The letter demanded the best, promising an impossible fee, but then insultingly tried to negotiate the terms by hinting at the prestige of being associated with the Sterling name. Richard was drowning, but still clinging to the illusion of his family's superiority. My decision was immediate and final. I would take the case. Not for the money. It was negligible to PAG, and certainly not to save them. I needed to fully comprehend the depth of their self-inflicted failure, using my 25-year-old analysis as the ultimate, unchallengeable proof of my long-vindicated intellect. This was not revenge. It was an archaeological dig into the ruins of my past, conducted by the expert who saw the fault lines forming decades before. My response, drafted and sent via Marcus, was a document of draconian, non-negotiable terms. It included a massive, non-refundable upfront retainer, a guarantee of total operational control over the entire Sterling organization, and a mandate of no questions asked regarding my methods or my background. Furthermore, I explicitly stated that absolutely no personal information would ever be shared about Mr. Vance. The only point of contact was Richard. The fact that the family, now facing total collapse, accepted these humiliating terms immediately, including wiring the exorbitant retainer within 48 hours, was a powerful testament to their desperation. The Sterlings, who had always commanded, were now reduced to supplicants. The preparation was the final, meticulous step of crafting Elias Vance for the field assignment. This wasn't just dressing up, it was a psychological transformation. The appearance asterisk, I chose a specific, understated bespoke charcoal suit that screamed quiet power. The watch was an expensive, nondescript model that valued function over flash. My hair was cut with surgical precision, and I held myself with an imposing, controlled aloofness. Every detail was designed to project a lack of emotion and an absolute mastery of the environment. The vocal changes asterisk, my register was slightly lower than my natural speaking voice. My cadence was measured, precise, and entirely devoid of emotional inflection. I consciously used highly technical, impersonal language to maintain an unbridgeable professional distance. The goal was to make them see a calculation, not a man. My objective was clear. I would infiltrate their history, observe the current toxicity of their interactions, and ultimately determine their fate. Were they worth the astronomical cost of saving, Or would destroying them be the final, necessary act of self-exoneration for the boy who was kicked out? To maintain the Elias Vance enigma, I chartered a small private jet to a tiny, local Connecticut airport, miles away from the major hubs where my business acquaintances would be present. I checked into an isolated luxury penthouse suite in a town adjacent to Greenwich. I would not stay in the Sterling neighborhood, refusing to re-enter the Gilded Cage. The drive to Sterling & Sons Manufacturing was the final hurdle. As the driver turned onto the factory road, I saw the building for the first time in 25 years. It was older, dirtier, and visibly neglected. The once proud brass sign was faded and tarnished. I anticipated a wave of devastating emotion, but instead, I felt only a cold, scientific curiosity. The pain was absent. The intellectual analysis was present. I was not Nathan returning home. I was Elias Vance arriving to dissect a failing specimen. The final show was about to begin. The meeting was held in the company's sterile, outdated boardroom, a room Nathan remembered for its tedious, annual budget reviews. As Elias Vance, I made my entrance, accompanied only by the silence I commanded. I met Richard first, along with the primary executive team, a collection of tired, middle-aged men clinging desperately to their titles. Richard, now 45, was a picture of soft, flustered incompetence. The golden boy had melted under pressure. He was clearly overwhelmed by the magnitude of the disaster, but still possessed the old, reflexive arrogance. He started condescendingly explaining basic manufacturing concepts to Mr. Vance, detailing the simple mechanics of a lathe. My response was a clinic in cold, dismissive technical inquiry. I cut him off mid-sentence, not with anger, but with a complex question about their outdated ERP system's integration with their supply chain logistics, using terminology Richard couldn't possibly grasp. I immediately established the power imbalance. I was the surgeon. He was the patient on the table. I spent the next several days in a blur of deep internal audit. I wasn't auditing their books. I was auditing their culture. The failure was a systemic rot far worse than the initial packet suggested. I found evidence of reckless spending on antiquated equipment, nepotism that placed unqualified, lazy family friends in critical positions, and a pervasive culture of blame where no one ever took responsibility. They were trying to manage a modern, specialized industrial firm with the mentality of a 1950s gentleman's club. The dramatic irony was so profound it almost made me smile. I was sitting in the back office, analyzing the current logistics model for their high-precision component division, and I identified the exact operational bottleneck, the reliance on two non-contiguous production lines, that I had first highlighted in my handwritten analysis 25 years earlier. That point was now the single greatest source of leakage, proving my teenage intellect was not just correct, but prophetic. It wasn't that I was a failure. It was that the Sterlings were pathologically incapable of listening to truth. My emotional audit of my parents was the hardest part of maintaining the Elias Vance facade. Arthur Sterling, in his late 70s, was still physically imposing but visibly withered by financial stress and the humiliation of needing a stranger's help. He was present in the factory, pacing the hallways, but he was functionally sidelined by Richard's disastrous CO tenure. He was furious at the necessity of hiring an outsider, the ultimate admission of personal failure. Eleanor, mother, was equally frail, but her obsession with appearances was intact. She invited Mr. Vance to a discreet, formal lunch under the pretense of getting to know our Savior. She attempted to charm me, asking leading, personal questions about my background, my family, and my schooling, trying desperately to gauge my social standing. "Are you from New England, Mr. Vance? You have the look of old money." I deflected her perfectly, using my crafted professional persona. "Mrs. Sterling, my background is proprietary. I deal in financial reality, not social standing. Now, about your pending litigation." She withered, realizing this man couldn't be controlled by her social currency. The most alarming discovery came during my investigation into the looming environmental lawsuit. I quickly realized this was not simply negligence that led to a civil suit. Richard, in an act of staggering self-preservation, had actively covered up the illegal dumping of industrial waste into a local watershed to save $500,000 in regulatory disposal fees. This moved the threat from a massive financial penalty to a severe criminal issue, specifically felony corporate fraud, and environmental endangerment. My extended internal conflict reached its peak. The moral lines were suddenly blurred. Saving the company now meant actively using my influence to protect Richard from the consequences of his felony. Allowing them to fail meant the collapse of the Sterling name and the loss of generational wealth, but it also meant justice and the satisfying of a deep-seated, justifiable, vengeful part of the abandoned boy. Midweek, Sarah approached Mr. Vance privately in the parking lot. She looked elegant but brittle. She was the only one who seemed genuinely terrified, not for her father or the business, but for the preservation of her inheritance and her lifestyle. She attempted to manipulate me, offering to cooperate and provide insider information on Richard's incompetence if I guaranteed her a sizable residual once the company was sold. She said, "You know how it is, Mr. Vance. We have to look out for ourselves. We all know Richard is an idiot, but Dad's name needs to be saved." In her voice, I recognized the same moral hollowness and opportunistic self-interest. She still saw me as a tool, now a highly paid one, but still disposable. I remained impassive, accepting her information and promising nothing, maintaining my distance. Arthur, suspicious of my total operational control and deeply insulted by my refusal to engage personally, demanded a private meeting with Mr. Vance. He tried to use the same tactics he used to cow employees for decades. "Mr. Vance," he started, staring me down across the desk, "you have too much power here. And I find you familiar. You remind me of a young man I once knew. Bright, yes, but he lacked the respect for tradition, the discipline to follow the rules. He was a failure." The word hung in the air, a final, unearned insult. I looked him directly in the eye, the alias holding firm, the cold indifference a perfect shield. "Sir," I said, my voice measured and precise, "your failures are statistically predictable. They are the result of adhering to tradition when the market demanded innovation. I deal in reality, not tradition." The rebuke was factual, emotionless, and devastating. Arthur sputtered, silenced by the realization that this man, this stranger, was the professional embodiment of everything he had rejected. I returned to my hotel suite to compile the final report, outlining the only 3 strategic paths forward. This was the moment of judgment. Option A, save requires immediate, massive capital injection, which I could personally provide through PAG's capital partners, total legal restructuring to settle the lawsuit quietly, and the immediate firing and criminal prosecution of Richard to satisfy regulatory bodies. This would save the factory but utterly ruin the family's name and force Arthur to publicly admit his son was a criminal. Option B, PAG acquires the factory's core, valuable assets, patents, select client lists, spins off the physical factory and all associated debt/legal liabilities, and the Sterlings walk away as minor, passive investors in the new entity. Option C, insolvency, immediate declaration of Chapter 7 bankruptcy, liquidation of all assets, and a guaranteed criminal referral for Richard's environmental crimes. I called the entire family together for the final presentation: Arthur, Eleanor, Richard, and Sarah. The meeting was held in Arthur's old mahogany-paneled office, the very same room where I had been kicked out 25 years ago. I began the presentation, delivering the bad news coldly, detailing the mathematical certainty of their complete, systemic failure. I didn't mince words. "Sterling & Sons is structurally insolvent and morally corrupt," I stated. I broke down Richard's cover-up and Arthur's blind management, showing how the rejection of data in favor of ego had led them to this precise point. As I clicked to the recommendation slide, I paused. Arthur was slumped slightly in his large chair, broken. Richard was visibly sweating. Eleanor was staring at the window, still trying to maintain her social composure. I performed the subtle acts of shedding my persona. I slowly removed the Elias Vance wristwatch, which was a symbol of the time I had mastered. I took off the specific pair of bespoke glasses, and I slightly changed my posture, allowing the suppressed Nathan to stand up straight. I looked at Richard, then directly at Arthur, whose eyes were focused on the screen. "This $12 million operational loss," I said, my voice dropping the refined Elias cadence, returning to the slightly rougher, more intense tone of the boy who learned on the streets. I predicted it in this room 25 years ago. I dropped the persona completely. My name isn't Elias Vance. I locked eyes with my father. It's Nathan Sterling. The ensuing silence was a physical weight. Then, Richard's choked gasp, Eleanor's high-pitched, social panic sob, and finally, Arthur's guttural, raging denial. Impossible. You're dead. You were a failure. The ghost was here. The moment of silence after my reveal was annihilated by Arthur's fury, which quickly morphed into desperate, pathetic pleading. He rose from his chair, his hands gripping the mahogany edge of the desk that separated us. Nathan, son, stop this charade. I forgive you, he choked out, his voice raw with stress and failing authority. You proved your point. Now, help your family. I forgive you for your indiscretion, for the path you chose. Help us. My cold reply was immediate, unyielding, and delivered with the full, surgical precision of Elias Vance, but with the painful memory of Nathan Sterling. You never forgave me for being myself, Arthur. You call me a failure. You kicked me out. I didn't return for forgiveness, Father. I returned for confirmation. I walked around the desk, stopping beside him, and pointed to the printed insolvency report in his shaking hand. You are the failure, Arthur. Your system failed. Your values failed. Your judgment failed. I am merely the one who quantified it. He slumped back down, a proud monument of an outdated era, finally crumbling. Eleanor, recovering her composure just enough to deploy her last, most potent weapon, tried to appeal to sentiment. Nathan, don't you remember Christmas Eve? The smell of the cedar tree? The train set you loved? I cut her off, the memory of her cold inaction overwhelming the distant, warm recollection. I remember the cold silence, Mother. The silence you offered when I walked out that door. You stood at the top of the stairs, worrying about the house staff, not your son. Your greatest sin wasn't cruelty, it was apathy. It was prioritizing the sterling social standing over the life of your own child. She couldn't meet my gaze, only staring at the expensive carpet. With the family morally bankrupt and emotionally shattered, I delivered my final decision. I would not personally save them. The business, tainted by Richard's criminal cover-up and Arthur's systemic refusal to change, was morally and financially unsalvageable. I chose option C, insolvency. The family business would be liquidated, stripped for parts, and the Sterling name, as a corporate entity, would be extinguished. More critically, Richard would face the full legal consequences of his environmental felony, which I had an ethical and professional obligation to report to the authorities managing the insolvency. The only way for the boy who was kicked out to break free from the haunting legacy of the past was to ensure that the source of that legacy was extinguished completely. I left the office immediately, leaving the family in shock and internal warfare. I didn't look back. The moment of revelation had achieved its purpose. I had closed the chapter permanently. I contacted Marcus, informing him the contract was terminated, the retainer was forfeit, and the required legal filings for insolvency were to be processed immediately through an affiliated, non-PAG law firm to maintain the firewall. I used PAG's extensive network to ensure the insolvency was handled cleanly, ethically, and without bias, but I offered them no personal quarter or intervention. The Sterlings were now simply a complex financial file, a distressed asset being managed by the market. Later that evening, I made a rare personal call to Silas Chun, my mentor. I summarized the surreal week and the final confrontation. Silas, the ultimate pragmatic strategist, listened quietly. His only response was, "A good strategist never falls into sentiment. The client, the family, was a failing asset. Did you execute the best option for the company's creditors and for your personal objective?" I replied, "Yes, Silas. I executed the inevitable." Silas congratulated me on closing my oldest, most emotionally complex file. "You proved their analysis of you was flawed, Nathan. Now move on to the next problem." A few weeks later, before flying back to Europe for my next engagement, I drove past the old Sterling estate one last time. It was listed for sale, the grounds already showing signs of neglect, the hedge untrimmed, the once pristine facade looking faded. The contrast between the imposing house and its imminent doom perfectly represented the final, logical outcome of Arthur's narrow, arrogant values. I felt no triumph, no residual pain, only a quiet, profound sense of closure. The weight of their judgment was finally lifted. I returned to my life in Manhattan, closing the final files on the Sterling liquidation. I reflected on the experience. The true victory wasn't the revenge, nor was it the wealth. The victory was the proof, the unchallengeable, mathematical proof of my own worth, and the realization that the source of my current, formidable strength was the defiant, logical mind of the 16-year-old boy they had cast out. The expulsion wasn't a punishment, it was a necessary catalyst. My greatest asset is no longer my net worth. It is the ironclad self-reliance forged in the crucible of my abandonment. I can look at any problem, any failing system, and know I have the discipline to fix it because I had to fix myself from the ground up. I was back to work, restructuring another major company, this time in Asia. I was still Elias Vance professionally, the distant, untouchable expert. But the internal wall, the emotional scar tissue, had softened, just slightly. I had confronted the ghost of my past and finally, definitively, won. I allowed Marcus to convince me to take a much-needed, week-long sabbatical, something I hadn't done in a decade. I realized that I no longer needed the Elias Vance armor to protect me from the Sterlings. I only needed it to protect me from the world's incompetence. The story concludes with me, Nathan, sitting in my silent, high-rise apartment, looking over the vast, glittering grid of Manhattan. The city is a system of complex flows and predictable logic, and I am the master of its hidden currents. The Sterling family is now just a blip, a closed file, a minor cautionary tale in my personal history. I reflect on the journey, from the rainy Connecticut curb to this quiet pinnacle of power. The freedom was always the ultimate prize. The wealth was merely the weapon that secured it. They called me a failure at 16. 25 years later, they were so desperate they called me the only man who could save them. But the real, enduring lesson wasn't that I became successful. It was that the boy they threw out was the only one in that entire family who had ever truly succeeded in walking away and building something real. Thank you for tuning in to this story of betrayal, ambition, and ultimate vindication. What would you have done in Nathan's position? Would you have saved them out of a sense of family or executed the final, logical failure as he did? Let me know in the comments below. If this story resonated with you and you appreciate the journey from failure to fortune, please hit the like button, subscribe to our channel for more true stories of triumph, and share this video with someone who needs a reminder that the people who write you off often end up calling you for help. Until next time, always trust your own analysis. Have a wonderful day.